You got your hand up there, Bruce, to start with.
Yes, I was wondering. I came from a background that was Reformed, Christian Reformed, and more recently from the Vineyard movement. And I guess the question I have is just your thoughts on this, because when we talk about evangelism years ago, we didn't really do much of it other than going door to door and hoping someone would receive it. And in Vineyard, of course, John Wimber would do signs and wonders, try to bring healing, words of knowledge, and such to people. Then they'd be open to hearing about Jesus. And I guess I was wondering, with everything you've experienced and learned, what your viewpoint is of encountering people who don't know Jesus. How do you approach that first time evangelism now?
Okay. I think the perspective has changed from we're trying to get people who are on the outside into something to helping people realize that they're already included in what Jesus did on the cross. Therefore, they don't have to do something to be included. They have to realize that they already are. So rather that we used to tell people, well, you're outside of God's presence, or you draw pictures of a bridge and you're on the other side, and the cross bridges it, and all those type of things, the four spiritual laws. And essentially what we were saying to people is, if you do this, you will be acceptable to God. And I no longer believe that that's the case. I believe everyone's acceptable to God through what Jesus did on the cross. He died for everybody, dealt with all of their sin, has reconciled everyone, and is not counting anyone's loss of identity against them. And so we used to say to people, you need to get born again. So if you pray this prayer, suddenly you will be born again, and then God will come into you, and then you can come into God, and everything will then change on the basis of you praying a prayer, which we said was by grace, but actually was by works, because you had to do something to enter it. So now I would say that everyone in Adam lost their identity, died, it says in 1 Corinthians 30:15, and therefore also all in Christ are made alive. So in the resurrection, everyone was made righteous, in Christ. Rather than when do you become righteous? Well, when you pray a prayer, or you're not righteous and then you are. So being born from above, which is what it literally says, rather than born again, it actually says from above. We were originally born from above, and then we're again reborn from above when we went through the cross. So essentially, Jesus has done everything to include everyone already. Therefore, you're just trying to get them to recognize that. Well, it's much easier to get them to do that when you're telling them that they're not, that God can't love them or can't have a relationship with them because of their behavior. So you're trying to connect with the things that are in them that are inspired by God's presence, love, and other things, to reveal that some of the things probably that they're passionate about in their lives have been inspired by God, and he can connect to it. So the way you do it for us has changed from getting someone to convincing someone that they need to pray a prayer, whichever way you do it, and people will do it to the extremes of, well, you're going to go to hell unless you pray this prayer, and God will punish you forever unless you pray this prayer, to, hey, God loves you, so why don't you accept him? So people use all sorts of different methods, terminology, ways of doing it. What we do is just introduce people to engage him. So we encourage people to just close their eyes, and then whatever particular engagement that you feel led to do, you help people engage, whether it be opening a door or drinking living water or coming to the Father and being embraced. It's all about a realization that God is already in them, and they don't realize it. So when they do realize it, faith arises. They believe in it. because they've experienced it, rather than we're trying to get them by blind faith to accept something that they've never experienced, on the hope that they will experience it should they have enough faith. And actually, it's the other way around. You know, when we realize and encounter, the faith automatically arises because now you believe. So, in essence, then people don't have to try and believe. And if you look in the Bible, every story of someone who encountered God, none of them were by blind faith. Every one of them encountered God. He either spoke to them or engaged them in some way, or an angel turned up, or something happened, which was reality. All the disciples of Jesus didn't have blind faith in him. They actually had faith in him because he was real to them. He walked with them. They had a relationship with him. So their faith in him was birthed out of their relationship, not that they were told to have a relationship with him in some way. They did, and everyone did. So we need to, and I think if you look at Galatians, I think it's Galatians 4:16, maybe 1:16, where Paul is talking about his experience on the Damascus Road. You know, what he described was that God was pleased to reveal Jesus in him, not outside of him, not somewhere else, but reveal Jesus in him. And that was before he ever did anything. And then he then goes on to say, and he's given me this ministry to preach Jesus in the Gentiles. But if you read virtually every actual English translation of that verse, it will say among, because it doesn't fit in with people's theology that Jesus can already be in people. He has to come into people after they do something. So it's translated, and he's giving me effectively this mission to preach Jesus among the Gentiles. And actually, that's the completely wrong translation. It's a totally different word, among and in. So our message of reconciliation, because we have a word of reconciliation according to 2 Corinthians 5, we carry this ministry of reconciliation to actually say God has already reconciled himself. Accept that, come into it, experience it, because he's already done it. And that's a very different way of sharing something. It is good news. It's not good news to tell people that they're excluded. If we can encourage people to see that Jesus has done everything to already include them, then it begins to change the way in which we share that good news. And it does become good news, because all they have to do is encounter it, and that realization manifests in their lives, and they end into a relationship with God. And you just have to trust him. You know, sometimes people, oh, I'm not sure how I could introduce someone to Jesus if it was, well, just trust him. You know, just encourage a person by saying, hey, God's already in you. And you can use Revelation 3:20 if you like. Behold, I stand at the door and knock. You know, open the door, let me in. You know, so effectively it's let me into a relationship with you, because I'm there looking to unveil and reveal myself. And that sort of is very different. But it takes the pressure off, because you don't have to try and convince someone of a theological truth, which actually is very difficult when it's not the truth. And I don't believe it is the truth anymore. So, you know, I could not use that methodology anymore. I need to help people to encounter God, and that encounter will unveil truth to them in whatever way that God chooses to do it. You know, and I've got lots of testimonies of God unveiling truth to people in different ways that only he would know. But you trust that if they do choose, and opening the door is just their choice, you know, and, you know, you can just use it to say, hey, by picturing this door and you choosing to open it, you're choosing to allow God to engage you. You know, he's waiting to engage you. Just let him, you know, so everything changes really in that.
Good. All right. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Anushka, you got your hand up there?
Yes, thank you, Mike. First, I'd really like to honor you for your immense contribution to us. I started my journey in 2015, and then enrolled in Engaging God in 2017. And I remember just 30 days after I enrolled, I remember you walking into my bedroom one night. I was so shocked because I was just going to go to bed. Like, it was so funny. There was nothing I could think of to actually say to you. And then, and since 2015, I wasn't connected to any group. And so then as soon as I joined you in 2017, I had a whole lot of questions, but then it helped because I seen you in the heavenlies later on and I could ask you questions. But here's one of the questions I wanted to ask you, with concerns the realms in eternity. Like I've seen these realms over the last few years, and Ancient of Days and Everlasting and all these places. I'm different in these places, or I see myself sitting, or I see fire. I see my crown on fire like Ancient of Days, my eyes on fire like everything. And then moving on to becoming and judging in that place, and moving on to becoming a being like an all-consuming fire where I could see everything around me burning up. And then I started realizing that I don't even need to throw things into the fire anymore. Just different ways of governing. And then moving on to everlasting, where I see in myself, I got what looked like a coronation. And when I went there after that, this is some months ago, and when I went there after that, I seen myself wearing this robe, which was the entire universe, you could say. It was like all of it all together. And it was like this never-ending robe. And even my crown looked like that, like stars and galaxies and just the whole thing. It was like I was wearing it like a garment. The only thing I've ever done before that, I used to go there, for the last few years. And the only thing that I used to do there was releasing the everlasting attributes, like releasing, everlasting love or joy or peace in situations.
Yeah.
But anything else you see when it comes to that? And is there a realm above that? I mean, I know there's a realm above that, but is there a name or something that you call that place?
Well, there's obviously created realms, and the realms of heaven of heavens and perfection and eternity, which that is not the same as the eternal now of God's presence, because everything that has been created within him. And in all of those experiences, you're getting closer and closer to engaging him in the outside of time and space. And heaven functions, and all the different realms of heaven all function on different realms of the speed of light, because they're all approaching God himself, who is light. And therefore they function on different time frames. And obviously it's all relative. So when you're there, it's relative differently to when you will be here. So in a sense, you can be there for an hour, and actually relatively you can be there for a month. And so the further you get, or closer you get it to God himself, the deeper the transformation takes place. And therefore the descriptions you're sharing are sort of descriptions of getting closer and closer to the revelation and the experience of God as outside of time and space in the eternal now. So when I've engaged there is no time, and everything's now. And it's very difficult to contain that within a finite mind until your mind gets rewired. So our eternal spirit was birthed in that place out of the heart of God and the desire of God for us, and he birthed us, and therefore our eternal spirit is used to that place. And our soul has been birthed in this realm, and therefore isn't used to living anything other than a linear existence. But what I found was that as I began to engage there again and go into the heart of God and into the mind of God and into his being and into the relationship between Father, Son, and Spirit, which is the now, that is love expressed continually in the now, then I found that my mind began to be renewed and remapped according to my my spiritual memory. So I began to reconnect to non-linearity, that you don't have to be in one place at one time in a progressive way, that you can be multiple places at multiple times and be unlimited as God is. And we have the mind of Christ, supposedly, but most of us really wouldn't be able to contain anything of the mind of Christ because it's beyond a linear approach. So you have to have that your mind remapped by your spiritual memory, if you like, to reconnect you to something which is not going to be linear. And when I went through these experiences and my mind got rewired and deconstructed and reconnected to that, remapped really with my spiritual memory, I then discovered I didn't have to be in one place at one time, and therefore I could be in multiple places multiple times and multiple places in the realms of heaven. Therefore my limitations of linearity and doing one thing after the other all of a sudden just disappeared, and I could be in the four faces of God, I could be on my mountain, I could be in the courtroom, I could be on the altar, I could be in the heart of God, I could be anywhere. And actually all of those things were all functioning simultaneously, and therefore that increased my capacity no end. So I talk about, the eternal now, of that's how it feels. It's just always now. So God is connected to everyone in time and space now. Therefore, everything that I thought or did 2 minutes ago, he was connected to, and anything I am going to think in 2 minutes' time, he's connected to now. Therefore, he can continually rework everything to enable us, even if we make really bad decisions or think really stupid things, to actually continue to enable us to come into an alignment with his original desire and intent for us, and not be restricted or limited by what we do. So it's difficult to explain with a linear perspective, but now has no perspective of linearity. So God is aware of everything and everyone that has ever existed and ever will exist, and is connected to them, and is working to bring good into all of their lives all of the time. Now, that's beyond our capacity to be able to, without an expanded mindset and a expanded consciousness, for us to conceive that. But I had a glimpse of it, and he showed me how he is connected, and it totally changed my whole perspective towards people, because he's continually at work, not to judge their decisions in a negative way, but to judge their decisions in light of the cross, and to redeem them and restore them and reconcile them all the time. Now, it is difficult to sort of really get hold of that until you have the experiences where your mind gets reconnected, but it is possible. And so there are different realms and deeper into God and approaching light. And then when you get to the speed of light, everything's now, and therefore that's our creative spirit came out of that now and is designed to live in that now. But our soul and our mind needs rewiring, realigning to come into be able to do that. And therefore, ultimately, when we begin to function in our fullness of sonship, it will have a creative perspective, not just a co-heirship perspective, that we will be able to function and operate in a similar way because we're sons of God. If Jesus was able to do things and he encouraged us to do things, then we need to be able to do things in the same way that he did. Otherwise, it would be really unfair to ask us to do something that we couldn't do. So we're maturing to the point where our consciousness is beginning to come into an agreement with the mind of God. And therefore, limitations and restrictions fall away, because nothing's impossible for God, Jesus said. And therefore, then nothing becomes impossible for us. And so we can begin to frame and shape reality from that now perspective, which means nothing that I've done can stop me fulfilling my destiny if I embrace what God does to bring good out of what I've done, to enable me to embrace what that will turn into as I follow the path, if you like. So I tend to think of, a lot of the way we describe time and the way we describe realms and different things tends to have that sort of, words which for God have different meaning. So everlasting, in English is very different from the word in Greek, which the Bible talks about. So the Bible doesn't talk about everlasting. It talks about age enduring, or to the end, to the age, or the end of the age. So God works in ways which are unveiling in different ways. And we could talk about ages to come, and we could talk about that. And I do believe that we are beginning to mature in a way that will take us into those depths of God, and they will be so transformatory. And obviously some of the things you're describing have beginning to change and rewire your thinking towards those experiences. Now, when you get into the heart of God and into the circle of the relationship between Father, Son, and Spirit in the now, that, if we continually dwell there, is continually feeding into the is when we're standing in the four faces of God in the realms of heaven, and that is continually enabling us to outwork what will be, so that what will be in agreement with God's heart in now. And that's a continually flexible, fluid thing. It's not fate, and it's not fixed and rigid. Therefore, time is not fixed and rigid, but is an ongoing, flowing way of outworking God's original intent and purpose, so that we all get to fulfill our destiny, and we all get to come into a relationship with God in sonship.
Yeah, I had learned this from you. I had picked this up in 2017 when I was a newbie, you could say. I mean, I was in heavenly realms for 2 years, but because of no interaction, I was kind of still like a newbie. And so then I remember listening to a video which spoke of being in multiple places. So that's how I kind of started accelerating myself, where when I would step in, I would see myself in multiple places and being in multiple places. And that really helped me huge, Mike, with what you had shared. And I have, Father had actually asked me to step into this place. This was also some years ago, where he told me to start stepping into his heart every day. And I started doing that. And as I started doing that, I started seeing that everything he ever created was in him. And I started understanding, like, just, how your understanding just completely changes, literally.
Yeah.
And I've seen myself creating these realms. And these are realms out of time and space, but they would somehow impact me. Like maybe in a place, where you have multiple levels and they're constantly changing. I think that's the what is to come. And I've seen places there, I've seen cities there, I've seen beings there, but they're always constantly changing. But when I started going there, I started seeing myself, my spirit rather, naturally creating stuff and creating what would be like these platforms, in essence, is what I would call them, to actually help me in the now. I'm not quite sure if I'm making sense there.
Well, it is. These things are quite difficult to put into English terminology, because we don't really have a frame of reference for it. I mean, when Paul went into these realms, he said that things were inexpressible. It wasn't that he wasn't allowed to express them, he just couldn't. He couldn't. I mean, a first century person could not express 20th century, 21st century, 20th. They could not express the things that we have now. They used parables of what was engaging in their day. Now we have parables which are engaging quantum and things that you can't see with the natural realm, and dimensions and dimensional physics. I mean, some people last year discovered that within the consciousness of the mind, there are 11 dimensional connections. And they did it using some mathematical topography, which I've got absolutely no idea about. But I do believe that what they found mathematically proves, again, that we can connect to those dimensions, and we're designed to connect to those dimensions. We just haven't learned to. And we are beginning to learn more. And I do believe that God is infinite, and therefore there is a continual unveiling of his infiniteness to us as we engage heart to heart or mind to mind, or this connection which comes through the spirit and is not always cognitively able to be expressed. You know, I know my spirit knows way more than my actual memory within my soul and my mind. And therefore I can't express those things until I can. And sometimes that might be an expression that suddenly I'm able to say things that I didn't really know or didn't really understand, but I can say them. And sometimes God takes me on a journey to uncover them and reveal them by encountering him, that brings an understanding to them which is beyond what I knew before, and now shapes my reality from a different perspective. But it is all a journey and a process of relational engagement that begins to bring about soul and spirit coming into agreement and alignment. And it may well be that our mind has to expand to be able to have the capacity to be able to not only engage these things, but to explain them in some way. And for some people, that will be nonsense. You know, and I've got journals of nonsense for most people to read. They wouldn't understand what I'm reading. Sometimes I didn't understand what I was writing at the time, but so they were nonsense to my cognitive mind, but actually to my spirit, they were truths that I embraced. And eventually they began to realign my cognitive consciousness to come into that reality and to experience it and engage it. But it's a journey, and you know, wherever you are on the journey, and some people are seemingly hardly started the journey from where some people are, they could look and think that person is completely lost the plot. He is completely insane from sharing things that they just could not relate to in any shape or form. And they would class that person as being mentally unstable in some ways. And yet, when they get further on their journey, they will realize that what they thought was madness is actually true reality. You know, one person's madness is another person's true reality, because their mind has been expanded or renewed, as the Bible says, to be able to engage and embrace those things. And for some people, when we talk about a relationship with God, those things are insane to them because they have no grid of reference for it. And we're talking about doing this or doing that. Even a very traditional religious sense, a lot of people think religious people are just insane, really, because they're thinking they're either deluded or operating in these delusions. But well, we know that it's true, but they don't believe it's true. Therefore, they think we're in unreality. And even within those who are in believers, there is so many different levels of reality that would be insane for some at the beginning of their journey, and would have been for me. You know, if someone had told me, 25 years ago that I would be doing the things I'm doing now, I wouldn't have believed them, because I would have had no grid of reference, and I would have thought that they were wildly making things up, really. Now, I like, fantasy and sci-fi and things like that, because I think they are glimpsing some things that, engage. I mean, I was talking to God today about some things of how love operates and how love works. And and deeper things. And he reminded me of a film, which is a modern film, Infinity Wars, which is the Marvel film of the Avengers, Infinity Wars. And in the film, that there are different stones that these guys have, and one's called the Infinity Stone. They're Infinity Stones, and one is the Time Stone. And Doctor Strange in the film has the Time Stone, and therefore he is able to engage in every possibility that exists for a particular situation. And then he suddenly sort of does something which is for the others really, really difficult to understand. He sacrifices himself, and actually the Father was reminding me that that is the reality. In all the possibilities that exist, the key principle was the sacrifice of Jesus before everything even started, that will enable everything to come to fulfillment, because it was on the foundation stone of creation before anything was ever more than a thought or a desire within God's heart. So it is very difficult to talk to people at a level unless they've experienced it. And so what I try to do is keep it in terminology that can at least give some hope for, well, there's more. And therefore I'm willing to pursue that, to embrace the more, even if I can't really explain it in a way which anyone can really understand. But at least there's something, the hope that there is more will cause us to pursue it, hopefully, and not get disillusioned because what we don't know, but to embrace what we do know so that what we can know can increase, because there's no end to the increase, and things are increasing, and our maturity is increasing, and therefore our level of authority is increasing, and therefore our abilities are increasing to align ourselves with God. And ultimately, in the ages to come, I do believe that there is creativity that as sons that we will administer. Now, a lot of people have birth things out of their spirit, birth galaxies, and people talk about birthing systems and things like that. Now, for some people, that would just be total fantasy. But for those who've experienced it, they know it's the reality for them. And I do believe that we're all going to be coming to a place where those realities will begin to just be normal to us. Now, the main thing in all this is it needs to make a difference to my daily life. Because if it's not making any difference to me, and I'm not actually more of a reflection of God on earth as a son, then it's all just fantasy, really, and it has no real value. The value in what we do is it on earth as it is in heaven. So all of these engaging in eternity and engaging these amazing dimensional perspectives is also earth can come into agreement and alignment with it. And that means my life and how I treat people and how I love people and how I'm free from fear and rejection and worry and anxiety and all of the things which the world lives in. The demonstration of living from a heavenly perspective is that we're not subject to those things. That becomes a model that people can look at and think, wow, what have they got? Why are they not worried, anxious, fearful in any way? Why are they not angry? Why do they not do this? And those should be questions people have, because of the fact that we are demonstrating a different level of sonship to them. And creation itself is longing, waiting for the revealing of that level of sonship. And it will begin to respond to us, and people will respond to us when we are truly shining with the light of love. And it's love that the world needs, and if most of religion does not demonstrate love, that's the sad thing of it. It doesn't demonstrate love. So we're not actually reflecting the true nature of God himself if we're not actually really truly demonstrating what true unconditional love is all about. And all religion has conditions attached to it. to receive or be loved, whereas unconditional love has no conditions. It's unconditional. That's the whole point. And anytime you see a condition put on love, you know it's not love, and you know it's not God. So if you're trying to please God, to earn something from him, favor, blessing, whatever it might be, then you're not operating and experiencing unconditional love, and your mindset is probably tied to an old covenant model of having to do something to receive something. And that isn't what God is like. He does not want us to have to do something to earn or work for anything. And if you're trying to please God, then you aren't aware that you're already pleasing to him. And he's trying to renew our minds to all of these mindsets so it will actually make a real difference to how we live on a day-to-day basis, and how we then interface with the world and reflect who God is to the world around us, which will be a very different picture for people to experience than the one created by most religious things. So yeah, be free, to live from that unconditional love, which is transformatory. It will change and transform us, restore us, make us whole in a way that nothing else can. Anyway, okay. All right, anyone else got anything they want to ask?
Mike, what you said about 11 dimensions, what we actually do, we process information in 11 dimensions, but it remains in a state called a superimposition, which is a myriad of possibilities until we decide on one specific outcome or expectation, then we just collapse it down into 3 dimensions.
Yeah.
There's something, there was an experiment done some time back called Wigner's friend, where Wigner does an experiment in one room and his friend is in another room doing the same thing. They both got different outcomes, and they're both right at the same time. So what we call objectivity that doesn't really exist. It just depends on what our expectation is. So if both of them are observing a photon of light, one expects it to move horizontal, one expects it to move vertical. Both of them see different things and they're both right at the same time.
Yeah.
So they did another thing where they, I think they call it democracy voting, where they try to see if the expectation of the majority would influence everyone. So, well, it doesn't work like that. Everyone has their own individual reality. It just depends on your expectation. I believe it applies to us in that the Bible says that unwavering man, it speaks about unstable. So unless we persist in the reality that we choose and just keep focused on what we choose, we'll eventually collapse the rest of the possibilities into our own reality.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's what we need to learn to do on a daily basis, of choosing the realities that are aligned with the heart of God, and therefore all the other possibilities that exist outside of that do disappear, they fade away, and that the reality that we're actually looking at collapses into experience. The problem is most people live in the matrix of a belief system which does not empower them to do that. So what they are doing is continually getting what they've always got, which is actually the slavery to the system that they live in. Whatever that system is, they're slaves to the machine effectively. And it's only a radical encounter with something that creates enough cognitive dissonance to shatter the illusion that sets us free to be able to choose those realities. Otherwise, we just keep choosing what we think is possible rather than what is actual possible. And most people, what they think is possible is nothing more than what they've already living in generally. And so it it is a process of coming into experiencing things in God, which shatters those illusions. I mean, the film The Matrix is, probably I think one of the best illustrations of that. And I was listening to a lady online who wrote those stories, and they got stolen from her. And she was a believer who wrote those, or the original scripts or the original stories for The Matrix, and they got stolen and produced into those films. And I think she has, I'm not sure whether she's still fighting for it, but I think there was a thing where that was recognized. So she was actually writing it from a Christian perspective. And the film itself unveils, that there is this illusion that most people are living in, which is not true reality, but people are caught in it and they believe it is. And therefore they're subject to the limits of the programming of that system they're in. Whereas, actually when you're not in a program system, then you're not limited by the programming. And therefore we need to break free from the programming of this reality to live in what God has created for us and who we actually are as sons of God. But science and people are more and more beginning to realize these things. And quantum physics is weird from a natural perspective, and and these experiments of how can you do the double slit experiment, and then there's the one that sets up sort of detectors to detect things, and you discover that actually that light knew what it was before it had ever happened, so it seemed to be ahead of itself. And all these things are just really quite weird, but they're scientifically provable. And I think this is why I think the parables of quantum physics today can help set us free from those restrictions, but you still have to be able to do it. And there aren't that many people who are testifying to doing it. I've got some testimonies of changing the realities to align with things, in terms of time and space and all sorts of different things. But these are just scratching the surface to when you think of the whole of the reality that most people are living in is, where that democracy voting thing, although, yes, everyone's living in their own reality, most people are living in a reality which is shaped by this illusion, and therefore they're in bondage to it. And it is difficult to get out of it, because people don't believe you can get out of it. So as a man thinks in his heart, so is he. So they're still living according to it. And it's only the few people that I think God is beginning to challenge those limitations and restrictions to unveil this to people. Like in the Matrix film, the whole thing was there were some people who'd broken out of the Matrix, and then they were looking to set some people free, but most people couldn't be free because they were stuck in it. So it is very interesting, in these whole issues of creating reality and what does it mean, and how does our reality affect other people? Because it does. My choices would affect your reality right now. If I chose to get up and walk away, you would be affected by my choice, and whatever I say can effectively interact with your reality to maybe shatter it, or to challenge it, or to cause you to think there's something more beyond perhaps what you're already living in, to pursue something more. And we just need to see that go out, and I think we can do it by releasing frequency. We can do it by releasing sound and words and things into the atmosphere to begin to soak the atmosphere with the potential for people to engage it and be challenged by it and begin to be free from the restrictions and chains of the bondage they're in to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, because that's actually the bondage they're in. they're caught in that system and are not free to engage the tree of life and go beyond it. But it's an ongoing journey and a process of our minds being renewed and remapped, and so that we actually do believe and engage those possibilities. And then you'll see there are multiple possibilities, and all of them are good when you're engaging out of the heart of God. You know, it's not just one fixed, rigid, I need to find the one way. We are creative sons to create the way. And this is why every day, if we're aligning ourselves with the heart of God, we're aligning history effectively with the heart of God. And it may only be for our own lives at the minute, but the more and more of us who begin to do it, the more effect we will have. And you have the power of consciousness, or a hive mind, when we start to come together with the mind of Christ in unity, one heart, one mind, one purpose. That will begin to exponentially increase the change that is taking place, which is why unity is so important to embrace, and why the enemy fights against it so much, to try and keep us from being one mind and one heart, one way of thinking in this. And I remember I was listening to a lady who has talked a lot about the power of consciousness, and particularly united consciousness. And she told the story of a doctor who wanted to disprove the power of prayer. So he elicited a whole lot of Christians to pray for a specific group of people. And he took a group of people and he split the group in half arbitrarily. And he asked the Christians to pray for one half for healing or for blessing or whatever it might have been. Mostly focuses on healing. And then the other half, they didn't know. And then he looked at the results to see whether prayer had a statistical, provable response to change actual health. And he actually found that statistically it did. What he didn't tell people was that he took a group of people from 10, 15 years before who were going through terminal diseases, and he split the group, and he didn't know what the outcomes were. So he split the group arbitrarily who were going through these disease processes, and a lot of them were terminal. And then when he saw the results, those who were praying 10, 15 years in the future actually had a statistical effect on those who were living 15 years in the past. So our energy and our focus of our minds and prayer, if you want to call it that, our declarations, our decrees, can actually influence unlimited by time or space, which is what these quantum physics exercises are actually, and experiments are proving. It's seemingly that there is no barrier in time to what you're doing when you focus, which for a lot of people will just think, oh, that's just crazy. But you know, someone trying to disprove the power that we have in joining our consciousnesses together, if you like, and coming into agreement, actually ended up proving that there is power in it. And there are lots of people who do this, and they have groups of people who focus on missing persons, and they all collectively begin to focus on that person's energy, that person would be found, and they have positive results in that happening. And so these things are quite challenging to the religious mindset, but are sort of beginning to expand and unveil and reveal that there's way more than we could have ever imagined or thought, which is not unexpected, because that's what Paul said. God is able to do exceeding abundantly beyond what we can imagine or think. And so he is expanding how we can imagine or think to increase, so that the things that were once impossible are now possible. You know, when I was brought up and when I was a young Christian, I didn't believe healing was possible because I had no understanding of it. And actually my theology said that God doesn't heal today. Or if he does, it's an exception and it's only according to his will. And most people prayed according to your will. Now, I didn't have any concept of that. But when I needed healing and I had experienced God in a different way and being baptized in the Spirit, all of a sudden, something which I didn't think possible now became a reality that I experienced. And I had numerous occasions where God healed me in different ways to show me that there are different ways of this happening, but it totally changed what I believe was possible. You know, and you know, just because we don't believe it now doesn't mean we won't believe it in the future, if we're willing to pursue and allow God to unveil our minds and reveal some of these things so that reality becomes aligned with what God's reality is and not just the limitations of our own. Yeah, and
There's an interesting book written since in the 90s, I think. It's a British author called Stephen Baxter.
Yeah.
It's called Time Like Infinity, I think. So about choosing realities. That was some 20 or 30 years ago.
Yeah, and I think these things are, you know, starting to get more mainstream and a little bit more out of the realm of the, you know, cranky sort of stuff into mainstream scientific reality. And some people grasp some of them and years ago started to connect with reality, with God. I mean, God's truth is not limited to the Bible or Christian books or any other. It can come in all sorts of different shapes or forms. Some of them include in movies and in lots of different ways in people's books, that they're connecting to something that God is revealing. And most Christians are way behind because they're stuck in the religious systems and the patterns that make these things impossible to them because they're stuck in the 1600s. You know, and some who are, you know, still believe that the King James Bible is the only authorized version of the Bible are stuck back there in the language and the way in which they pray and everything else, because religion has trapped them into the belief that nothing really is going to change. In fact, we're just going to wait to be rescued and hope that one day we'll be rescued and God will, you know, give us a new earth and a new heavens. And all of those things tie us to, well, we cannot do anything about it. We just have to wait for God to do it. You know, and you know, the Catholic system totally believes that only God can do anything in heaven and on earth. So their expression of your kingdom come, your will be done on earth, heaven, is God does it all and we just are observers. And in some ways, the Muslim beliefs are very similar. Everything is according to the will of Allah. So everything that happens must be according to his will. So it's a circular argument. And there's no breaking that circle or cycle if you are stuck in that. You know, but God is wanting to bring people out of those cycles and set us free so that actually our minds can be restored and renewed and we can really be free. So, yeah, awesome. Yeah, Anushka, you got your hand there?
Yeah, I had a question, Mike, just now, based on what you were saying with creating your own reality. It made me think of something because as a man thinks in his heart, so are we, right? We create our own reality and just stuff like that. And I started getting interested in quantum physics when I started stepping into heavenly realms. Whereas before in school, I just hated physics and science. But then it was like I just began to understand and I was just drawn to it. But what also started happening was, which is the question I actually have, I'm not seeking to control it, and maybe my mind is getting in the way of this, but there have been instances at my workplace where I changed and or shapeshifted or whatever you may call it, and And it started happening as soon as I started stepping into heavenly realms. And I literally freaked one of my colleagues out completely. And that person couldn't even speak. And I was working for a bank, JP Morgan Chase. And that person ended up asking me if I was demon possessed. And I thought, oh my goodness, like, how do I, because people are so naturally scared of what they don't understand. And immediately they think of something bad and demonic instead of thinking God. But anyways, but then it started happening more frequently. And then, my other who began to say, your face is shining, which is different from shape-shifting, but the other person saw me shape-shifting. So I'm wondering, do we come to a point where, because when it was happening, I was not aware of it and I did not feel anything and I didn't feel different when it was happening. So one, I did not even know except from the reaction and what was happening to these people. So I'm not saying I'm going to control it, but at the same time, I'm wondering if, like there is a point where I can, start it, stop it, more like, so I don't freak people out, or because I'm not even aware of it. Now, I know it's probably my human mind, and it, I don't know, but yeah, that was a very difficult situation to be in. But then Father asked me to step out of my job and to leave my job. And so then I did. So then they're no longer seeing my face, which was fine with me. But
yeah, I mean, I have testimonies from quite a few people who are experiencing similar things, that they're either shining or translucent or sometimes invisible to people. Which I think is a little bit like these things are forerunner experiences that seemingly are happening. Then we need to pursue them and see how we can actually use them for the outworking of the kingdom, because Jesus only did what he saw the Father doing, and therefore he had the capacity to do multiple things, but only did that which was benefiting the kingdom. So sometimes I think some of the experiences are designed just to capture our attention, to get us to pursue, so that we can see how we can outwork those things. It's like, when I first relocated, it was totally, well, not by accident, because God did it, but I was totally unaware of what was going on. I didn't feel anything, didn't sense anything, but I ended up, somewhere else, and immediately I was aware that I was somewhere else, but I wasn't aware of how I got there. Now, that said, well, that is possible. So now I've experienced that, and that now is possible. So I can now think in alignment with that is possible. And so for quite a while, and what I didn't want to do is just go and try and do that because I could, or because I wanted to, but because I actually needed to, in alignment with what God wanted me to do. So I know how to do a lot of things, but I don't necessarily do them because there's no need to do them, because I don't have the motivation to do them within God's purposes. But I did one stage need to travel somewhere because of an issue, and to catch a train, or for my daughter to catch a train, in which then I chose to relocate and to enable me to get somewhere quicker than I could have done. And my daughter was with me. Now, again, neither of us felt anything, but we were somewhere else, effectively. We got to a place in a time which wasn't possible naturally. But there was a purpose for that. And when the purpose is to outwork our destiny, our mandates, then I do believe that we will learn how to control those things. And if there's a purpose for you radiating or shining glory that will not freak people out, or if it does freak them out, it will draw them to God rather than away from him, then we'll be able to do that and actively do that. Jesus obviously walked through people, he disappeared. There were things that were very supernatural, which today would probably freak most people out, most Christians out, if not necessarily most people. But in essence, I do believe the key is, does this help me or enable me to fulfill my destiny, my mandate, rather than, wouldn't that be good as a party trick? Or wouldn't that be good to be able to do, to show people this, and or to show off? And we've got to be very careful that we don't do things to draw attention to us. But the reason that we shine with glory is that it draws attention to our Father rather than our Son, because Jesus never wanted to draw attention away from the Father. You know, he always wanted to point people to the Father. And I think as the motives of our heart get purified and refined and we become more mature, I think we will be entrusted with more. At the moment, I think these are just enticements to pursue a glimpse of what is possible. You know, and there may be occasion where we need to shine and radiate. There may be occasions where we need to disappear, where we need to walk on water, where we need to levitate, where we need to do supernatural things, because that's the only way that we can outwork what we're called to do and what we're mandated to do. There won't be an earthly human way of doing it. Most people try and find a human way of doing it, therefore don't need the supernatural. I always remember a story of somewhere out in the Far East, whether it's Malaysia or Indonesia, somewhere, of this tribe that were drawn to God, and there was some revival going on in another tribe, and they were drawn by the light to go there, and therefore there was a river in the way in flood, and so they so desired to go and engage this that they walked across the river every day to go, walked across the river, and then one day someone built a bridge and they walked over the bridge, and then they no longer needed to walk over on the water. So sometimes, you know, we can develop ways of doing something that leave the supernatural out of it, but there are coming things that we will not be able to do with our natural intellect or in any way other than the supernatural dimensions of it. And I think more of those are coming. So yeah, just keep pursuing and get to that point where you're at peace that it's okay to outwork some of these supernatural things, because that's God's purpose and reason, rather than it being just, hey, that will be fun. You know, it would be fun to put your hand through a wall, I guess, but what would be the purpose of it other than fun, unless you needed to? And I think that's where we're beginning to mature. We will use the things we need to, and we won't do things just because we can do. Jesus could have raised every single person in Israel from the dead who had died because of the power that was contained within him. And yet he only chose to do that with a few people. And I think that's the maturity, that he only did what he saw the Father doing. And remember, the enemy tried to tempt him to turn stones into bread, to use his power outside of the mandate that God had given him, because God had given him the mandate to fast for 40 days. And then Satan came and said, oh, you're hungry, turn these stones into bread, because the Bible says so. And so he tried to trip him and trip him up and trap him into following the path that Adam followed, which was do it yourself. Do this independently of God, because you can. And of course he said, no, man must not live by words that come from what is written, but actually what comes from the mouth of God. So what is actually the reality of that relationship that he had in being able to hear the Father's voice and know the Father's heart every day. Yeah, Lisa, you got your hand there.
I've been trying to understand experience I had when I was young. I was about 13 years old, and we moved from Israel to Norway. And I started missing my home, and I cried like every night because I wanted to go back, and I was praying that God would that I would just go back just for a second. And I was praying these prayers a long time, and I had this experience where suddenly I was in Israel. I was back, and I know it happened, and I don't know if my body was there, but I know it happened because it freaked me out so much, and I thought it was bad, so I never did it again, and it made me really afraid. And then I started thinking, now for some years ago, I started thinking, oh, maybe that was God, like, taking me back. But now I've been wondering, was it me doing it because I wanted, like, creating then my reality, or was it God doing it?
Well, I think some of it is that God gives us the desires of our heart.
Yeah.
And therefore, when you really set your heart towards something in that sort of way, with that sort of emotion, then God can give you the desire of your heart, which probably he did.
Yeah.
But ultimately, the desires of our heart need to be aligned with the desires of his heart. So intimacy with him will enable that to be something which is not just out of the emotion. Obviously, you were grieving over this, and therefore your emotions were feeling, and God is one who carries our griefs and our sorrows. So therefore, there was a sense where he was, I guess, responding to your grief and sorrow and alleviating it,
Yeah.
in a way. Now, as a child, then people have all sorts of experiences like that, I think, because God seems to respond to children in a way that he doesn't respond to adults. And maybe it's childlike faith, or maybe it that way. When I do activations with people to go on a mission for God, hey, where does God want to send us in time or space? I would say about 80% of the testimonies I get are engaging with children, saving children, rescuing children, doing something with children. Because I think God responds to children's hearts, cries, emotions, fear, whatever, in a way which is different from adults. Now, I do believe that if we set our hearts on the desires of God's heart, then again, those desires will be fulfilled. The problem is hope deferred. It makes the heart sick. And so many people have been disappointed and disillusioned and have been let down, and in their life, things haven't worked out the way they thought they might work out, that their heart is sick, and therefore, the hope fulfilled is like the tree of life. And we need to have our hearts restored and made whole and healed from those experiences that we may have had, which are damaging, so that the desires of our heart can be fulfilled, because they're not coming out of the brokenness and the fragmentation of our soul. It's like, God give you things which are not necessarily his will? Yes, is the answer. Well, he did with the children of Israel when he gave them a king. It wasn't his will to give them a king. He didn't want them to have a king, but he said, okay, if you want one, here's one. But I'll warn you, it won't be as good as you think it's going to be. But then he even wove that into his story, that then David and therefore Jesus would come out of that kingly line. And so God is able even to weave into his overall sort of narrative for bringing about his heart, even our brokenness and even the things. Now, is it his desire that we're broken, and is it his desire that those things? No, not necessarily, but he can still, because everything is now to him, he can still weave it all in and still bring good out of it, and can still bring about his purposes through even the things that we do which are not necessarily what he wants, because that is how much he loves us. It would have been interesting if you had not been frightened by it and had continued to see what would have happened. But and I do believe some children do. you know, and they live in engaging the angelic realm, and they do live in things. Usually the abilities that children have are sort of removed from them through education and through the education system that educates them out of believing that that's possible, and therefore they must have thought they made it up. And parents are like that, you know, they you know, try and get children to live in the real world, as they put it, rather than in the imaginary friends and those type of things, which are the creative way of living, in a way which I do believe God intends us to be able to function in. But we often can't because we don't believe it, and because that was, so you're making it up. It's a figment of your imagination, you know, as if that's a bad thing. And children, by the time they get to school, other than those who are very strongly creative and continuing their creative expression, usually using arts or music, you know, or things like that, that is the way they express their creativity, rather than more of the supernatural dimension, which I do believe is possible. And we need to encourage our children to embrace that, and not tell them it's wrong to, you know, be creative in that way, spiritually as well as physically. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, I've got time for one more. Cato, I think you got your hand up there. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I don't know if we have time enough to get in this subject. If we don't have time, maybe another time. I was thinking regarding Israel. Lisa talked about Israel, and I reminded a verse from Romans 11, where it's 11:15, where it says that for if their rejection means the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance mean but life from the dead? So I don't know, has this happened or will happen, or has anything to do with Israel, or how can I understand this verse?
I mean, that is a very big subject.
Okay, then another time. Yeah. We will meet another time.
I would say that in a lot of the issues to do with Israel, I would encourage people to go back to God and ask God to give them a revelation of what the original context of some of those Bible verses were that were future to them, that they maybe passed to us. And also, let's make sure that we're not caught up in the religious views, which a lot of them were birthed very in a modern times. You know, I know Israel's a very emotive subject with a lot of people, and it causes a lot of emotional response. And if you say anything against physical Israel, then you get called anti-Semitic and everything else. And there are a lot of Jewish rabbis who do not believe in the state of Israel. They do not believe the state of Israel is actually God's purpose. And there's a whole lot of them. You never really hear about them or see them because the press does not allow it to be seen. But there are some YouTube videos that you can see, and they're called Jews Against Israel. And there are rabbis who actually have totally different views than the Zionist type Western view, which is I believe is a politically motivated agenda. Now, if you listen to them, they will put it in the context of that God divorced Israel and only the Messiah can bring them back into a relationship with him. And therefore, those who are divorced have no entitlement to the land. And that is true because it says so in the Bible, but that's not the theology which has been adopted around Israel as been developed within the evangelical community today. So I would encourage people to go and take it back to God with an open mind and ask God to give them insight into the truth of it. You know, you don't have to believe what I'm saying, and I'm not promoting that agenda. I mean, I don't talk about it a lot unless I'm asked. But I do believe that, as with a lot of other things within the Christian institutional religious perspectives aren't necessarily right. The same would be the whole thing of hell and all the other things. You know, a lot of what Jesus taught and what Paul was teaching were for the church in that generation. And most of what Jesus taught, if not all of it, related to Israel, happened in that generation with the destruction of the temple, the end of that age and the old covenant age. And the reality is that is the law is obsolete and has faded away. And therefore we don't need to live under the law. We don't need to live under the old covenant. And therefore we don't need to live with the concept that God is living, will bring back a temple in Israel and introduce animal sacrifices, which is really where all that teaching goes. And in reality, why would he? Those things have ended. There's one sacrifice for all time, and that is Jesus. So a lot of the extremes of that teaching, you know, will even go to the extreme that Jewish people do not need Jesus to be accepted by God. Now, I just don't believe that's true. And even when it talks about Israel in Matthew 11, in Romans 11, if you read Romans 9, Paul says not all Israel were actually really Israel. Only those of faith were actual Israel. And those who were living in Israel were not spiritually the children of God. You know, so Paul said that if you read Romans 9. So part of the problem is a lot of our theological systems around it are come through the evangelical perspective, and there are lots of others, the Reform perspective and even other theological perspectives, which are very different, but most people don't know about them, you know. So I would encourage anybody to go back to God with it and to ask him for the revelation. And you can't blame me or anybody else, but it'll be God that will tell you the truth if you're willing to listen. Sometimes it will take a real cognitive dissonant encounter to break us free from those belief systems that we're brought up with. And they are so ingrained that we don't even think there's a possibility that there's anything else. Now, I've gone through that numerous times, and all those things I believed, I no longer believe. Now, I would have absolutely dogmatically held fast to those beliefs because I totally believed that they were true. And then I encountered God, and now I realize they aren't true. So it's possible that a lot of things that we have believed may not be the truth. But we need to be open for God to do that. And that can be quite difficult. It was for me in my deconstruction process. It was quite difficult. But if we're pursuing the relationship, then he will begin to demolish any beliefs which are not in alignment with. So anyway.
Okay. Thanks for your response.
Okay. It's to go into it would need a lot of depth. The same with going into eschatology and going into the end of the age and the end of the world and all that stuff. But, you know, I always go back to Jesus. What did Jesus say? You know, and that's the key. What did Jesus say? And if you then use the lens of Jesus to interpret the Old Testament and the New Testament, then you're going to see it through that. And I think what Jesus said in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the synoptic gospels, are very different, and the audience was very different from what was said in John. And John's gospel came from an intimacy with the heart of Jesus and the Father that is very different, and is actually speaking to us today, whereas a lot of what Jesus said was speaking to the Jewish people under the old covenant of his day, and he warned them that all the things that he was saying was going to take place in that generation. And I do believe it did in that way. Okay, I need to leave it there because I've got another meeting soon, and I'll